The Devil's Dictionary, written by Ambrose Bierce in 1906, defines faith as belief without evidence in what is told by one who speaks without knowledge of things without parallel. That definition is demonstrably accurate. There are many thousands of denominations in any given religion because none of them can show that they know what they're talking about and that they're not all just making it up. Personally, I don't understand being completely convinced of something when there's no reason to believe it at all, especially when it seems impossible. It seems to me that some people make believe whatever they want to just because they want to, and it doesn't matter to them whether it's true or not. I get that some people have a deep-seated emotional need to believe certain things, even if it's not really true, because somehow believing that makes them feel better, or so they say. I just don't have that need. I want to understand how things really are and to improve that understanding. So I don't want to be fooled into believing anything that isn't really true. I also heard a professor of philosophy define religious faith as pretending to know what you don't know. I've often said something similar myself, that faith means asserting baseless speculation of impossible absurdity as if it was a matter of fact. It's like making up your own statistics on the spot. It's fundamentally dishonest. The philosophy of science is very different. We can't say that something is true until or unless we can show the truth of it, the evidence leading to that conclusion. Because you have to be able to show what you know. If you can't show it, then you don't know it, and you shouldn't pretend like you do. If you assert that something is a fact, but you can't show that it is, that's an unsupported assertion. In science, that is the same as a lie. A religion is nothing but unsupported assertions, things that are not evidently true, or worse, that are evidently not true, but that you're determined to profess and believe anyway, regardless whether it turns out to be true or not. How dishonest is that? Religious apologists are defenders of the faith, meaning that they have to systematically make up excuses devised to justify doctrinal atrocities or rationalize away any arguments or evidence that might challenge a sacred assumption. The assumption is sacred because it is held a priori, meaning that those who hold that position must never admit when they're wrong on any critical point, even when that is clearly proven, because then the whole house of cards will come down. The illusion will be dispelled, and we're talking about a favorite fantasy that believers will pay all they have to preserve. So, however dishonest faith already inherently is just to start with, apologetics is even worse. Then we get to presuppositionalism. The precepts are all about pretending to know things they don't know, but they go a step further. Not only do they pretend to know that they're right, but they pretend as if you know it too, as if you're the one lying about what you do or don't know or believe, because religious apologetics requires projecting your own faults onto your opponents as if they're guilty of it, not you. Precepts cannot accept the simple truth that when it comes to baseless assumptions of impossible absurdity, that you're not convinced, that you think it much more likely that someone is making something up or getting something wrong, because that much is obvious. No, the precepts will instead say that the reason you don't believe is that you don't want to believe, or that you really do believe, you're just pretending not to. It is a fact that I don't hold anything to be true just because I want it to be, and nor do I doubt other things or hold them to be false just because I would rather believe something else. No, it doesn't matter what I would rather believe. I am compelled to consider whatever the evidence indicates, whether I like it or not. If I could make believe whatever I want to believe, like believers do, then I'd be a few inches taller, an inch or two longer, 30 years younger, and $1 million richer. I'd like to believe that I had Jedi powers too. But I apparently have a psychological limitation such that I have to accept the facts, honestly, even the ones that I don't like or find inconvenient. This, to me, is logical, whereas I see religious faith as all non sequitur conclusions stemming mostly from false premises. So, how do the precepts interpret reasonable skepticism?
Yeah, atheists can do great things. Yes, they can discover things. But without God, it won't make logical sense. It'll just confuse you more and more. Logic itself is grounded in God existing.
Is it? I don't know how that even can be true. I certainly don't think it is true. But what do I know? I'm not a philosopher. However, my guest today, Dr. Stephen Law, is Director of Philosophy at the Department of Continuing Education at Oxford University. And he not only publishes peer-reviewed articles to different philosophical journals, he's also the editor of the journal Think, which is sponsored by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And thank you for helping me out with this, Dr. Law. I think you're an ideal person to ask about this presupposition that logic somehow demands the existence of a God.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, and I'll do my best.
All right, so I often hear this kind of thing where where there are some people who presuppose that even the laws of physics require a mind to guide them somehow, and I don't understand how what I understand logic to be, how that even can. Why would that even involve a God?
Well, I guess the thing to do here is to sort of wind back a bit to the thought that, and I think this is where the presuppositionalist is coming from, really, that we're all making assumptions, background assumptions, presuppositions, the atheist as well as the theist, and that's not completely implausible, actually. So we might agree with them about that. We might say, okay, that it's true. There are certain things that we all take for granted. Perhaps as an atheist, I take for granted, for example, the existence of an external world of trees and houses and mountains and planets and so on. I assume my senses are providing me with access to that. And I'm assuming that, reason is a reasonable guide to truth. It's a fairly reliable mechanism upon which we can rely in terms of finding out what's true and what's not. The reason that these things might be presupposed is if you try and justify reason, you'll need to use reason. Your justification will therefore be circular. It will be a bit like trusting a second-hand car salesman because he says he's reliable. I mean, that's no justification whatsoever for trusting the second-hand car salesman. And similarly, if any justification of reason requires that we use reason to justify reason, then the justification will be hopelessly circular. So maybe we just have to kind of presuppose, maybe.
Well, if I remember David Hume, I wish I
Yeah.
had the direct quote on tap, but I mean, David Hume said that we have no choice to make the same assumption as a baby would, or that a beast would, that there is an external reality, and that that our senses give us some information about that. And the way he put it implies that it would be literally madness to try to operate on a different assumption.
We would consider people mad if they possibly if they didn't make those same background assumptions. But then when you start doing philosophy, you often end up occupying some fairly mad places, and it may just be true that we cannot rationally underpin. We must presuppose that there is an external world out there to which our senses give us access, and reason is a reliable route to truth. So just for the sake of argument, let's just concede that, because it won't matter too much so far as dealing with the presuppositionalist is concerned. I think a lot of people find themselves feeling like they have to show that somehow reason can be rationally supported in some non-circular way, or else they're going to be in terrible trouble. It's not true. We can make these concessions and we're still going to win. So I'm going to suggest.
The way Cy Ten Bruggencate put this, he said that his argument was virtuously circular and that ours was viciously circular.
Yeah, well, he can assert that if he likes, but
my objection to giving them that first premise is that it is a matter of choice. I mean, with the believer, they will very often have admitted to me, believers do, that they believe whatever they want to, simply because they want to, that they can believe hard enough and it'll become real. But I don't have a choice to believe what is not evidently true, and nor do I have a choice to presuppose beyond that there is a natural world, and that the evidence that the beast or the baby would have to make the same assumption, would have to. I literally have no choice but to believe that.
Yeah,
so that's the reason I can't extend that first premise.
Yeah, well, you pointed out that Hume says that we just can't help ourselves. That's just the way we're put together, is that we will make these presuppositions. We just can't help it. But that doesn't mean that they are reasonable, particularly that they can be justified. I mean, Hume didn't think that they could be, perhaps, but still, it may be that we're so constituted that we just can't help ourselves. We're just going to make these assumptions, and then, of course, Psi and other presuppositionalists are going to say, so you're helping yourself to assumptions that you cannot possibly justify, and then they work from there. So let's see where they go next. So what they tend to do then is they say, well, at least this is true. Then it's faith positions all round, because you assume that you have access to an external reality via your senses, and you assume that reason is a reliable route to truth. I, on the other hand, I assume that God exists. I begin with that particular presupposition. And in fact, armed with that presupposition, I no longer have to make the assumptions that you make, because if my God exists, my God is a good God who is not a deceiving God. And so once I've presupposed that my God exists, it's then not unreasonable for me to suppose that I have reliable senses, and that reason, my faculty of reason, is reasonably is reliable, is a reliable mechanism. So it's faith positions all round, they'll then say. You're relying on your senses and reason. I don't have to do that because I'm relying on God instead, as to sort of provide an underpinning for it all. But it is, in fact, faith positions all round. So now the two positions, theism and atheism, according to our opponent here, they come out as level pegging, at least. You make presuppositions, I make presuppositions. It's presuppositions, it's faith positions.
I'm so irritated at this false equivalence where they always want to tell me that I believe what I believe on faith. I don't even believe like a believer does. I tentatively accept what I am compelled to accept, and I will immediately drop that once I see that the reasoning or that the evidence wasn't sufficient to hold it in the first place.
Well, good. But maybe they think that they can show that. They can show that yes, you don't have good grounds for making the assumptions that you do. But anyway, let's move on to the third step then in sort of the presuppositionalists' argument, which is that they then seem to think that actually it's not level pegging atheism and theism, because actually there's something fundamentally incoherent or self-defeating about the atheist's position, whereas there isn't when it comes to the presuppositions made by the theist. And there are various ways in which they could try and argue that, and it depends on the presuppositionalist exactly what they're going to say. So Cy ten Bruggencate, for example, seems to do it by just constantly pushing the challenge at you. Well, how do you justify logic? I can do it because I've got God, but how do you justify it? You can't do it. You fail. I win. Your position is untenable, and mine is not. That's the kind of argument that he tends to run. So so I've kind of set out their stall for them. I hope I've done it justice. It begins by pointing out that we're all making presuppositions. Arguably, that's true. It then suggests that this means that theism and atheism are level pegging, rationally speaking. Arguably, that I don't think that is true for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But then they tend to go on and say, actually, they're not level pegging because there's something fundamentally incoherent about the atheist's position, whereas that's not true of the theist's position. My first objection really to that line of argument is, why can't, if people have to make presuppositions, why can't they just presuppose that they have fairly reliable senses, and that the faculty of reason is a reasonably reliable mechanism when it comes to figuring out what's true? The presuppositionalist is going to need to come up with some argument for why we can't just presuppose that, because they said, it's okay to presuppose stuff. They're presupposing God exists, or they're presupposing that the Bible is inerrant and can be relied upon. So once they've granted that it's okay to just presuppose stuff, why can't we, as atheists, just presuppose that we have reliable senses and a reliable faculty of reason? Their arguments there tend to be weak, and we could look at some if you like, but the more serious problem, I think, is this, that actually even if it's true that we all start with a presupposition, it seems to me that the atheist's presupposition is not self-defeating in a way that the theist's is. This is how I would respond to the presuppositionalist. You know, take it or leave it. You can respond in different ways. But my first port of call would be this: if you presuppose that there's a God who is a good God and that won't deceive us, and that then underwrites our senses and our faculty of reason, so we can now reasonably rely on those because we would presuppose that there is such a being. The problem then is that our senses and reason then provide us with ample evidence that there is no God, in the form of, for example, the evidential problem of evil. The world contains such vast amounts of pain and suffering that it just cannot plausibly be considered the creation of a supremely powerful and benevolent creator. There's abundant evidence that even if there is some intelligence behind the universe, it's not that sort of intelligence. It's not some kind of supremely powerful and benevolent creator, which is what God is supposed to be. So they have this bind that they start off making an assumption. They presuppose that their God exists. They then use this to underwrite their senses, but their senses then provide them with ample evidence that the initial assumption that they made isn't even true. And so they end up undermining the rationality of their own position. In a way that the atheist does not, because the atheist starts off with, perhaps, arguably, starts off with the assumption that, well, I have reliable senses. I'm going to presuppose that, and I'm going to presuppose that reason is fairly reliable. But your senses don't then furnish you with great evidence that your senses simply can't be trusted. Of course, we know that we're prone to optical illusions and cognitive biases and so on, but generally speaking, there is no evidence that our senses are completely untrustworthy and not to be relied on at all. So there's nothing particularly self-defeating about the presupposition made by an atheist, assuming that they make one, whereas there is something deeply inconsistent about the theist's position, because they start off assuming that God is good, and then they use that to get all my senses are reliable and reason can be relied upon. But that then delivers ample evidence that their initial presupposition is not true. So it seems to me that presuppositionalism suffers that fatal flaw. Even if you grant them the premise that we are all making presuppositions, we can still run a very good argument for saying that their position ultimately undermines itself, whereas ours does not.
The first problem I have with this is one, they're arguing that, you can't justify your reason with reason. Well, okay, so but I at least am using reason, and they're admitting that they're not. So that's the first problem. And still, there's no I'm sorry.
Well, they're not admitting that they're not using reason. They're just saying they're presupposing something. They're not using reason when it comes to belief in God or the reliability of the Bible or whatever their presupposition is. And they'll say, and you too, you're not using reason to justify reason. So you see, all round, we're making moves, we're making assumptions that we're not using reason to underpin. And I'd be inclined to just go, okay, then concede that, because even if we concede that, we can still win the argument.
On the point on that logic is grounded in the existence of God, I know that a lot of these apologists love to cite the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and on this point, it says that logic is a deductive system of linguistic argument. An argument is valid if there's no interpretation in which its premises are all true, and yet its conclusion is false. They say that an argument is derivable only if it is valid, such that no deduction takes one from a true premise to a false conclusion. Thus, deductions preserve truth, and an argument is valid only if it is derivable, providing a deduction for every valid argument. There's not a bit of that I can see that is grounded in the existence of a God.
Well, that's just a description of what we mean by deductive logic. That's what we're talking about. It's true that there's no description of God in there, but that doesn't mean that you can't reasonably infer God. Maybe you can, in the same way that if you look at a car manual for my particular car, there's no mention of the person that designed the car. It just tells you how to do various things with the system. But it would be ridiculous to suppose that my car doesn't have a designer, that there isn't a mind behind it. So that's the argument that they're going to use there. So you better be ready for it.
Yeah, I caught this one line out of that article too. It said, while most philosophers may hold that classical first-order logic is uniquely correct, however, it seems that some religious extreme, in my opinion, it seems to me that some religious extremists must instead embrace logical nihilism, that no logic is correct, and that's why they have to put everything on the what you called equal pegging. And that's always been my first problem, is that we don't have that equal pegging ever. That article was quite long, more than 19,000 words, but I noticed the word God does not appear there even once.
No, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't make a case for saying that you do need God to underpin logic. I mean, you can't, but they're still welcome to have a go if they wish. So here's the thing: it's presuppositions all round. Maybe, I mean, that may not be true. I mean, maybe you don't need to use reason to underpin reason. I mean, here's one way out of one way of avoiding that conclusion. You could say that rather than engaging in procedural reasoning from premises to conclusion, that is the way that you often will attempt to justify your conclusion. But if your conclusion is that logic is reliable, well, unfortunately, because you're using logic in the inference, oh dear, there's some kind of vicious circularity allegedly in the use of reason to justify reason. But one response you could make is we can just directly observe that certain very simple rules of inference are truth preserving. That if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's not something that you infer using reason. You can just see that if those premises are true, well, then the conclusion must be true. If that's true, then it turns out you don't need to use reason in the sense of procedural reasoning or inference to justify reason. So it may be that we don't even need to make that concession, but I'm inclined to make it just for the sake of argument. Let them have their premise that you can't justify reason, you can't reasonably suppose that reason is reliable. We're essentially presupposing that it's reliable. Let them have that, because they're still going to be in terrible trouble later on.
Maybe it's my own limitations when the precepts tell me, ask me like, who invented the laws of logic? Well, I always saw presupposition as a fallacy. You're presupposing that it was a who, right? So that's first fallacy in your argument. But when you look at what they call the laws of logic, would that not have to be true regardless? I can't imagine a situation where that would not be true. So
you mean?
It just seems to me that they're arguing for a fantasy that on some level, it seems to me that they know that it's a fantasy, because they will not go through the rigors that they would for any other thing that didn't require faith to believe. Every other thing they will evaluate in a more objective way, but not this. This is the one time that they reject reason and come up with these fallacious arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they'll probably reject what I'm about to say, but it seems to me that the way in which they're arguing is typical of a certain sort of style of argument for extraordinary hidden beings. I mean, the fact is that if you invoke a sort of agent with magical powers operating behind the scenes, you can explain pretty much anything you ever want explaining. So, for example, if I can't explain why my keys have ended up on the sofa when I'm positive I left them on the mantelpiece, I might, I might say I might admit that I don't know how that happened. It's completely baffling. If somebody then says, no, I can explain it with my magical being, you see, if you've got gremlins in your house, and the gremlins are mischievous beings, and they love to hide stuff, and they have these powers. They're capable of doing this kind of thing. So you see, you really need to accept that there are gremlins living in your house, because they explain something which otherwise you as you've just admitted, you cannot explain. Now, there's something's gone wrong there. That is not a good reason, a good justification for believing in gremlins. that style of argument is, you know, very common when it comes to any kind of belief in the supernatural. This is very often the method of argument, and the presuppositionalist is in effect running something along those lines. They're saying all you need a kind of cosmic mind to explain this stuff. Explain it in some other way, or you've failed. Therefore, you need your cosmic mind to account for it, to account for the cogency of reasoning and the reliability of your senses and so on. So it's basically one of those arguments. And if you're generally suspicious about those kind of arguments, and I think you should be, then I think, you know, you have grounds for being quite suspicious about the presuppositionalists' approach. But you know, it's kind of I mean, you know, as a philosopher, I quite enjoyed engaging with Cy. This happened about a decade and a half ago, so I've forgotten most of what we said to each other. But I was in Spain, and I had just fallen off my mountain bike, and I had broken one collarbone and dislocated the other collarbone permanently, it turns out, having hit the ground sideways on. So it had a big impact, and I was in agony, and I couldn't really do very much. So I was looking at my computer, and Cy cropped up, and so I ended up having this long exchange with Cy, which I quite enjoyed, because I'm a philosopher and I like, you know, drilling into all of this stuff. Ultimately, I think it, you know, his position is quite ludicrous, but you know, he's very, very good at cooking up all sorts of moves, and he makes all sorts of ingenious moves in order to try and tie you up in knots. And I quite enjoyed sort of teasing all of that apart and pulling apart the various threads to it. For Cy, I think the most important one, this may not be true of most presuppositionalists, but the one that he really relies on the most is if you ever give him an argument, he will say, you're using an argument, you're using logic. Justify logic. You must justify logic before you're even entitled to use any kind of argument against me. See, you can't do it, so your argument collapses. I win by the impossibility of the contrary, is a phrase that he used to say constantly. So he kind of pushes that attack every single time you say anything at all. And so really the strategy, and he admits this at one point, is to just shut people up. Just close them down so they can't really say anything at all, because the minute they say anything, he just points the finger and says, oh, you've got an argument, you're using logic, justify it. If you can't justify it, you know, you have to shut up. It's a very ingenious rhetorical strategy. The real problem with that is that actually, as Cy even admits on his own website, that doesn't mean that atheists can't prove things. I mean, what they might not be able to do, if he's correct, is they may not be able to justify to themselves that they know that the conclusion is correct. But that doesn't mean that they can't actually construct a cogent argument using the very same logic that Cy himself is entitled to use. And so if you can use Cy's logic to show that Cy is incoherent, inconsistent, has contradicted himself, or whatever it might happen to be, then you've refuted him. It doesn't really matter whether it doesn't matter whether you, as the critic, can justify your use of reason or not, given that you're using the very same form of reasoning that he is, and he says it's reliable, and he says he can know it's reliable because he's got God underpinning it. Then you know, your argument succeeds. It's a red herring that he's throwing your way there, trying to get you bogged down in justifying reason, when the fact is that you've given him a perfectly good argument that he can't cope with, and he's just trying to shut you up, is what he's really trying to do.
I have to share this with you. I had an informal debate discussion with him on a radio show about a decade ago. And I remember I had just read this article about Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, who said the same thing that Cy-Ten Bruggencate said, that God had revealed the truth of his word through the scriptures to him in such a way that he could know it for certain. And this truth that was revealed to him through the scriptures that he could know for certain was that Jesus was not the physical manifestation of God in the flesh. So I present to Cy-Ten Bruggencate, both of you, you and Sir Isaac Newton, are both saying that God has revealed his word to you in such a way that you can know it for certain. However, you both come to opposite conclusions with regard to this Jesus character. And the interesting thing about that is given that I have two people making two assertions, they're both the opposite, and they're both based on the exact same criteria. The only difference is that one of you is Sir Isaac Newton, the most brilliant man in history, and the other one is you.
Yeah.
What choice is there in who to believe?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know what he's going to say. And not just, oh, it's me. He's going to say, oh, well, I agree. You know, we can't both be right. One of us is infallibly connected up to God. It's just that it's me, not Newton. Newton's made a mistake in thinking that he has this infallible access to reality provided to him by God, whereas I really do have it. Yeah, that's that. That is what he's going to say.
Well, I don't know where we can go from there, but
he may say, but you know, I'm not attempting to prove to you on my say so that God exists and has provided me with this access. I'm going to instead, and this is his strategy, challenge you to explain how you justify reason. And if you can't do that, then because I can and you can't, I win. That's always how it pans out every time with Psi. I don't know if that's true of all presuppositionalists, but certainly that's his strategy. And for the reason I just explained, he's just making a mistake there, because even if I'm not justified in using reason in the way I am, given that I am nevertheless using the very same form of reasoning that he is, and he's justified in using it, I can use his reason against him very effectively. And you know, no amount of him pointing the finger and saying, but you must justify logic, really gets around that point. He's just changing the subject at that point. And
then there's the other, and again, this is a logical argument, and Seitan was completely remiss on this. He says, but when he said that you can't know anything unless you know everything, or you know someone who knows everything, and he admits that he doesn't know everything, but he says he knows someone who knows everything. And I said, but you just said, according to your logic, that you don't know anything if you don't know everything, and you don't know everything. You think you know someone who knows everything, but you don't know anything if you don't know everything. So how do you know that you know someone who knows everything? But again, logic doesn't work on presupps.
No, that sounds, if that's what he said, that doesn't seem really, doesn't, appears to be just logically inconsistent, doesn't it? You're right. And you can point that out, and he's going to point the finger at you and say, no, you have to justify logic, otherwise you can't use logic against me. It is not true. We can point out that he's using logic, and if it's reasonable for him to rely on reason and logic, then we can point out the fact that his own logic has just undermined itself. There is no obstacle to us doing that. So it seems to me that the basic strategy should be this then: when you come across these people, I would just, you know, for the sake of argument, concede that, yeah, we're all making presuppositions. Maybe the atheist is presupposing that there's an external world to which their senses give them access. Maybe they're presupposing that reason is, you know, a reliable mechanism when it comes to trying to figure out what's true. Maybe these are things that we presuppose. Just give them that for the sake of argument. They are then presupposing something, that there's a God, and their God, they then believe, underwrites the reliability of their senses and reason. So they don't, unlike the atheists, they don't have to just presuppose that these things are reliable because they've got God. The problem then is that their senses then provide ample evidence that there is no God. So their presupposition ends up undermining itself, whereas mine, as an atheist, doesn't. My senses don't give me good reason to distrust my senses across the board. My use of reason doesn't give me good grounds for thinking that reason can't be trusted. How could it? Because if you were using reason to undermine reason, it would undermine reason, and so you would have failed to undermine reason. You can't use reason to undermine reason. You can't use reason to justify reason, but neither can you use it to undermine reason either. So at least we don't have that particular problem. We may make presuppositions, but they're not self-defeating. The theists' presuppositions are self-defeating. That's, so far as I'm concerned, that's the bottom line.
That sounds like a good point to end. Thank you, Doctor.
Sure. I hope that was helpful. It's such a complicated issue. There are so many aspects to it. It's quite difficult to do it justice, but yeah. Thank you.